Chapter 4. Jackson Lemon had said to Dr. Feeder in the Park that he would call on Mr. and Mrs. Freer, but 3 weeks were to elapse before he knocked at their door in Jermyn Street. In the meantime he had met them at dinner, and Mrs. Freer had told him how much she hoped he would find time to come and see her. She had not reproached him nor shaken her finger at him, and her clemency, which was calculated and very characteristic of her, touched him so much, for he was in fault, she was one of his mother's oldest and best friends, that he very soon presented himself. It was on a fine Sunday afternoon, rather late, and the region of Jermyn Street looked forsaken and inanimate. The native dullness of the brick scenery reigned undisputed. Mrs. Freer, however, was at home, resting on a lodging-house sofa, an angular couch draped in faded chintz, before she went to dress for dinner. She made the young man very welcome. She told him again how much she had been thinking of him. She had longed so for a chance to talk with him. He immediately guessed what she had in her mind, and then he remembered that Sidney Feeder had named to him what it was this pair took upon themselves to say. This had provoked him at the time, but he had forgotten it afterward, partly because he became aware that same night of his wanting to make the young Marchioness his own, and partly because since then he had suffered much greater annoyance. Yes, the poor young man, so conscious of liberal intentions, of a large way of looking at the future, had had much to irritate and disgust him. He had seen the mistress of his affections but 3 or 4 times, and had received a letter from Mr. Hardman, Lord Canterville's solicitor, asking him, in terms the most obsequious, it was true, to designate some gentleman of the law with whom the preliminaries of his marriage to Lady Barbarina Clement might be arranged. He had given Mr. Hardman the name of such a functionary, but he had written by the same post to his own solicitor, for whose services in other matters he had had much occasion, Jackson Lemon being distinctly contentious, instructing him that he was at liberty to meet that gentleman, but not at liberty to entertain any proposals as to the odious English idea of a settlement. If marrying Jackson Lemon wasn't settlement enough, the house of Canterville had but to alter their point of view. It was quite out of the question he should alter his. It would perhaps be difficult to explain the strong dislike he entertained to the introduction into his prospective union of this harsh diplomatic element. It was as if they mistrusted him and suspected him, as if his hands were to be tied so that he shouldn't be able to handle his own fortune as he thought best. It wasn't the idea of parting with his money that displeased him, for he flattered himself he had plans of expenditure for his wife beyond even the imagination of her distinguished parents. It struck him even that they were fools not to have felt subtly sure they should make a much better thing of it by leaving him perfectly free. This intervention of the solicitor was a nasty little English tradition, totally at variance with the large spirit of American habits, to which he wouldn't submit. It wasn't his way to submit when he disapproved. Why should he change his way on this occasion, when the matter lay so near him? These reflections, and 100 more, had flowed freely through his mind for several days before his call in Jermyn Street, and they had engendered a lively indignation and a bitter sense of wrong. They had even introduced, as may be imagined, a certain awkwardness into his relations with the house of Canterville, of which indeed it may be said that these amenities were for the moment virtually suspended. His first interview with Lady Barb after his conference with the old couple, as he called her august elders, had been as frank, had been as sweet, as he could have desired. Lady Canterville had at the end of 3 days sent him an invitation, 5 words on a card, asking him to dine with them on the morrow quite en famille. This had been the only formal intimation that his engagement to her daughter was recognized, for even at the family banquet, which included 6 guests of pleasant address but vague affiliation, there had been no reference on the part either of his host or his hostess to the subject of their converse in Lord Canterville's den. The only allusion was a wandering ray, once or twice, in Lady Barb's own fine eyes. When, however, after dinner, she strolled away with him into the music-room, which was lighted and empty, to play for him something out of Carmen, of which he had spoken at table, and when the young couple were allowed to enjoy for upwards of an hour, unmolested, the comparative privacy of that elegant refuge, he felt Lady Canterville definitely to count on him. She didn't believe in any serious difficulties. Neither did he then, and that was why it was not to be condoned that there should be a vain appearance of them. The arrangements, he supposed her ladyship would have said, were pending, and indeed they were, for he had already given orders in Bond Street for the setting of an extraordinary number of diamonds. Lady Barb, at any rate, during that hour he spent with her, had had nothing to say about arrangements, and it had been an hour of pure satisfaction. She had seated herself at the piano and had played perpetually, in a soft, incoherent manner, while he leaned over the instrument, very close to her, and said everything that came into his head. She was braver and handsomer than ever, and looked at him as if she liked him out and out. This was all he expected of her, for it didn't belong to the cast of her beauty to betray a vulgar infatuation. That beauty was clearly all he had believed it from the first, and with something now thrown in, something ever so touching and stirring, which seemed to stamp her from that moment as his precious possession. He felt more than ever her intimate value, and the great social outlay it had taken to produce such a mixture. Simple and girlish as she was, and not particularly quick in the give and take of conversation, she seemed to him to have a part of the history of England in her blood. She was the fine flower of generations of privileged people and of centuries of rich country life. Between these two, of course, was no glance at the question which had been put into the hands of Mr. Hardman, and the last thing that occurred to Jackson was that Lady Barb had views as to his settling a fortune upon her before their marriage. It may appear odd, but he hadn't asked himself whether his money operated on her in any degree as a bribe. And this was because, instinctively, he felt such a speculation idle. The point was essentially not to be ascertained, and because he was quite ready to take it for agreeable to her to continue to live in luxury. It was eminently agreeable to him to have means to enable her to do so. He was acquainted with the mingled character of human motives, and glad he was rich enough to pretend to the hand of a young woman who, for the best of reasons, would be very expensive. After the good passage in the music-room, he had ridden with her twice, but hadn't found her otherwise accessible. She had let him know the second time they rode that Lady Canterville had directed her to make, for the moment, no further appointment with him, and on his presenting himself more than once at the house he had been told that neither the mother nor the daughter was at home. It had been added that Lady Barb was staying at Roehampton. In touching on that restriction she had launched at him just a distinguishable mute reproach. There was always a certain superior dumbness in her eyes, as if he were exposing her to an annoyance she ought to be spared, or taking an eccentric line on a question that all well-bred people treated in the conventional way. His induction from this was not that she wished to be secure about his money, but that like a dutiful English daughter she received her opinions, on points that were indifferent to her, ready-made from a mamma whose fallibility had never been exposed. He knew by this that his solicitor had answered Mr. Hardman's letter, and that Lady Canterville's coolness was the fruit of the correspondence. The effect of it was not in the least to make him come round, as he phrased it. He had not the smallest intention of doing that. Lady Canterville had spoken of the traditions of her family, but he had no need to go to his family for his own. They resided within himself. Anything he had once undiscussably made up his mind to acquired in 3 minutes the force, and with that the due dignity, of a tradition. Meanwhile he was in the detestable position of not knowing whether or no he were engaged. He wrote to Lady Barb to clear it up, to smooth it down, it being so strange she shouldn't receive him, and she addressed him in return a very pretty little letter, which had to his mind a fine bygone quality, an old-fashioned, a last-century freshness that might have flowed, a little thinly, from the pen of Clarissa or Sophia. She professed that she didn't in the least understand the situation, that of course she would never give him up, that her mother had said there were the best reasons for their not going too fast, that thank God she was yet young and could wait as long as he would, but that she begged he wouldn't write her about money matters. She had never been able to count even on her fingers. He felt in no danger whatever of making this last mistake. He only noted how Lady Barb thought it natural there should be a discussion. And this made it vivid to him afresh that he had got hold of a daughter of the Crusaders. His ingenious mind could appreciate this hereditary assumption at the very same time that, to light his own footsteps, it remained entirely modern. He believed, or thought he believed, that in the end he should marry his gorgeous girl on his own terms, but in the interval there was a sensible indignity in being challenged and checked. One effect of it, indeed, was to make him desire the young woman more intensely. When she wasn't before his eyes in the flesh, she hovered before him as an image, and this image had reasons of its own for making him at hours fairly languid with love. There were moments, however, when he wearied of the mere enshrined memory. It was too impalpable and too thankless. Then it befell that Jackson Lemon, for the first time in his life, dropped and gave way. Gave way, that is, to the sense of sadness. He felt alone in London and very much out of it, in spite of all the acquaintances he had made and the bills he had paid. He felt the need of a greater intimacy than any he had formed, save of course in the case of Lady Barb. He wanted to vent his disgust, to relieve himself from the New York point of view. He felt that in engaging in a contest with the great house of Canterville, he was, after all, rather single. That singleness was, of course, in a great measure an inspiration, but it pinched him hard at moments. Then it would have pleased him could his mother have been near. He used to talk of his affairs a great deal with this delightful parent, who had a delicate way of advising him in the sense he liked best. He had even gone so far as to wish he had never laid eyes on Lady Barb, but had fallen in love instead with some one or other of the rarer home products. He presently came back, of course, to the knowledge that in the United States there was, and there could be, nothing nearly so rare as the young lady who had in fact appealed to him so straight, for was it not precisely as a high resultant of the English climate and the British Constitution that he valued her? He had relieved himself, from his New York point of view, by speaking his mind to Lady Beauchemin, who confessed that she was infinitely vexed with her parents. She agreed with him that they had made a great mistake. They ought to have left him free. And she expressed her confidence that such freedom could only have been, in him, for her family, like the silence of the sage, golden. He must let them down easily, must remember that what was asked of him had been their custom for centuries. She didn't mention her authority as to the origin of customs, but she promised him she would say 3 words to her father and mother which would make it all right. Jackson answered that customs were all very well, but that really intelligent people recognized at sight, and then indeed quite enjoyed, the right occasion for departing from them. And with this he awaited the result of Lady Beauchemin's remonstrance. It had not as yet been perceptible, and it must be said that this charming woman was herself not quite at ease. When, on her venturing to hint to her mother that she thought a wrong line had been taken with regard to her sister's prétendant, Lady Canterville had replied that Mr. Lemon's unwillingness to settle anything was in itself a proof of what they had feared, the unstable nature of his fortune. Since it was useless to talk, this gracious lady could be very decided, as if there could be any serious reason but that one. On meeting this argument, as I say, Jackson's protectress felt considerably baffled. It was perhaps true, as her mother said, that if they didn't insist upon proper pledges, Barbarina might be left in a few years with nothing but the Stars and Stripes (this odd phrase was a quotation from Mr. Lemon) to cover her withal. Lady Beauchemin tried to reason it out with Lady Marmaduke, but these were complications unforeseen by Lady Marmaduke in her project of an Anglo-American society. She was obliged to confess that Mr. Lemon's fortune couldn't have the solidity of long-established things. It was a very new fortune indeed. His father had made the greater part of it all in a lump a few years before his death, in the extraordinary way in which people made money in America. That, of course, was why the son had those singular professional attributes. He had begun to study to be a doctor very young, before his expectations were so great. Then he had found he was very clever and very fond of it, and had kept on because, after all, in America, where there were no country gentlemen, a young man had to have something to do, don't you know? And Lady Marmaduke, like an enlightened woman, intimated that in such a case she thought it much better taste not to try to sink anything. "Because in America, don't you see," she reasoned, "you can't sink it. Nothing will sink. Everything's floating around, in the newspapers." And she tried to console her friend by remarking that if Mr. Lemon's fortune was precarious, it was at all events so big. That was just the trouble for Lady Beauchemin. It was so big, and yet they were going to lose it. He was as obstinate as a mule. She was sure he would never come round. Lady Marmaduke declared he really would come round. She even offered to bet a dozen pair of gants de Suède on it, and she added that this consummation lay quite in the hands of Barbarina. Lady Beauchemin promised herself to contend with her sister, as it was not for nothing she had herself caught the glamour of her friend's international scheme. Jackson Lemon, to dissipate his chagrin, had returned to the sessions of the Medical Congress, where, inevitably, he had fallen into the hands of Sidney Feeder, who enjoyed in this disinterested assembly the highest esteem. It was Dr. Feeder's earnest desire that his old friend should share his credit, all the more easily that the Medical Congress was, as the young physician observed, a perpetual symposium. Jackson entertained the entire body at dinner, entertained it profusely and in a manner befitting one of the patrons of science rather than the humbler votaries. But these dissipations made him forget but for the hour the arrest of his relations with the house of Canterville. It punctually came back to him that he was disconcerted, and Dr. Feeder saw it stamped on his brow. Jackson Lemon, with his acute inclination to open himself, was on the point more than once of taking this sturdy friend into his confidence. His colleague gave him easy occasion, asked him what it was he was thinking of all the time, and whether the young Marchioness had concluded she couldn't swallow a doctor. These forms of speech were displeasing to our baffled aspirant, whose fastidiousness was nothing new, but he had even deeper reasons for saying to himself that in such complicated cases as his there was no assistance in the Sidney Feeders. To understand his situation one must know the world, and the children of Cincinnati, prohibitively provincial, didn't know the world, at least the world with which this son of New York was now concerned. "Is there a hitch in your marriage? Just tell me that," Sidney Feeder had said, taking things for granted in a manner that of itself testified to an innocence abysmal. It is true he had added that he supposed he had no business to ask, but he had been anxious about it ever since hearing from Mr. and Mrs. Freer that the British aristocracy was down on the medical profession. "Do they want you to give it up? Is that what the hitch is about? Don't desert your colours, Jackson. The suppression of pain, the mitigation of misery, constitute surely the noblest profession in the world." "My dear fellow, you don't know what you're talking about," Jackson could only observe in answer to this. "I haven't told any one I was going to be married. Still less have I told any one that any one objects to my profession. I should like to see any one do it. I've rather got out of the swim, but I don't regard myself as the sort of person that people object to, and I do expect to do something yet." "Come home, then, and do it. And don't crush me with grandeur if I say that the facilities for getting married are much greater over there." "You don't seem to have found them very great," Jackson sniffed. "I've never had time really to go into them. But wait till my next vacation and you'll see." "The facilities over there are too great. Nothing's worth while but what's difficult," said Jackson, with a sententious ring that quite distressed his mate. "Well, they've got their backs up. I can see that. I'm glad you like it. Only, if they despise your profession, what will they say to that of your friends? If they think you're queer, what would they think of me?" asked Sidney Feeder, whose spirit was not, as a general thing, in the least bitter, but who was pushed to this sharpness by a conviction that, in spite of declarations which seemed half an admission and half a denial, his friend was suffering worry, or really perhaps something almost like humiliation, for the sake of a good that might be gathered at home on every bush. "My dear fellow, all that's rot." This had been Jackson's retort, which expressed, however, not half his feeling. The other half was inexpressible, or almost, springing as it did from his depth of displeasure at its having struck even so genial a mind as Sidney Feeder's, that in proposing to marry a daughter of the highest civilization he was going out of his way, departing from his natural line. Was he then so ignoble, so pledged to inferior things, that when he saw a girl who, putting aside the fact she hadn't genius, which was rare, and which, though he prized rarity, he didn't want, seemed to him the most naturally and functionally founded and seated feminine subject he had known, he was to think himself too different, too incongruous to mate with her? He would mate with whom he damn pleased. That was the upshot of Jackson Lemon's passion. Several days elapsed during which everybody, even the pure-minded like poor Sidney, seemed to him very abject. All of which is recorded to show how he, in going to see Mrs. Freer, was prepared much less to be angry with people who, like her husband and herself a month before, had given it out that he was engaged to a peer's daughter, than to resent the insinuation that there were obstacles to such a prospect. He sat with the lady of Jermyn Street alone for half an hour in the sabbatical stillness. Her husband had gone for a walk in the park. He always walked in the park of a Sunday. All the world might have been there, and Jackson and Mrs. Freer in sole possession of the district of St. James. This perhaps had something to do with making him at last so confidential. They had such a margin for easy egotism and spreading sympathy. Mrs. Freer was ready for anything, in the critical, the real line. She treated him as a person she had known from the age of 10, asked his leave to continue recumbent, talked a great deal about his mother, and seemed almost for a while to perform the earnest functions of that lady. It had been wise of her from the first not to allude, even indirectly, to his having neglected so long to call. Her silence on this point was in the best taste. Jackson had forgotten how it was a habit with her, and indeed a high accomplishment, never to reproach people with these omissions. You might have left her alone for months or years, her greeting was always the same. She never was either too delighted to see you or not delighted enough. After a while, however, he felt her silence to be in some measure an illusion. She appeared to take for granted his devoting all his hours to a certain young lady. It came over him for a moment that his compatriots took a great deal for granted. But when Mrs. Freer, rather abruptly sitting up on her sofa, said to him, half simply, half solemnly, "And now, my dear Jackson, I want you to tell me something," he saw that, after all, she kept within bounds and didn't pretend to know more about his business than he himself did. In the course of a quarter of an hour, so appreciatively she listened, he had given her much information. It was the first time he had said so much to any one, and the process relieved him even more than he would have supposed. There were things it made clear to him by bringing them to a point, above all the fact that he had been wronged. He made no mention whatever of its being out of the usual way that as an American doctor he should sue for the hand of a marquis's daughter. And this reserve was not voluntary, it was quite unconscious. His mind was too full of the sudden rudeness of the Cantervilles and the sordid side of their want of confidence. He couldn't imagine that while he talked to Mrs. Freer, and it amazed him afterwards that he should have chattered so, he could account for it but by the state of his nerves, she should be thinking only of the strangeness of the situation he sketched for her. She thought Americans as good as other people, but she didn't see where, in American life, the daughter of a marquis would, as she phrased it, work in. To take a simple instance, they coursed through Mrs. Freer's mind with extraordinary speed. Wouldn't she always expect to go into dinner first? As a novelty and for a change over there, they might like to see her do it. There might even be a pressure for places at the show. But with the increase of every kind of sophistication that was taking place in America, the humorous view to which she would owe her immediate ease mightn't continue to be taken. And then where would poor Lady Barb be? This was in truth a scant instance, but Mrs. Freer's vivid imagination, much as she had lived in Europe, she knew her native land so well, saw a host of others massing themselves behind it. The consequence of all which was that after listening to her young friend in the most engaging silence, she raised her clasped hands, pressed them against her breast, lowered her voice to a tone of entreaty, and with all the charming cheer of her wisdom uttered 3 words: "My dear Jackson, don't. Don't what?" He took it at first coldly. "Don't neglect the chance you have of getting out of it. You see, it would never do." He knew what she meant by his chance of getting out of it. He had in his meditations of course not overlooked that. The ground the old couple had taken about settlements, and the fact that Lady Beauchemin hadn't come back to him to tell him, as she promised, that she had moved them, proved how firmly they were rooted, would have offered an all-sufficient pretext to a man who should have repented of his advances. Jackson knew this, but he knew at the same time that he had not repented. The old couple's want of imagination didn't in the least alter the fact that the girl was, in her perfection, as he had told her father, one of the rarest of types. Therefore he simply said to Mrs. Freer that he didn't in the least wish to get out of it. He was as much in it as ever and intended to remain in it. But what did she mean, he asked in a moment, by her statement that it would never do? Why wouldn't it do? Mrs. Freer replied by another question. Should he really like her to tell him? It wouldn't do because Lady Barb wouldn't be satisfied with her place at dinner. She wouldn't be content, in a society of commoners, with any but the best. And the best she couldn't expect, and it was to be supposed he didn't expect her, always grossly to monopolise, as people of her sort, for that matter, did so successfully grab it in England. "What do you mean by commoners?" Jackson rather grimly demanded. "I mean you and me and my poor husband and Dr. Feeder," said Mrs. Freer. "I don't see how there can be commoners where there aren't lords. It's the lord that makes the commoner, and vice versa." "Won't a lady do as well? Our Lady Barb, a single English girl, can make 1,000,000 inferiors." "She will be, before anything else, my wife. And she won't on the whole think it any less vulgar to talk about inferiors than I do myself." "I don't know what she'll talk about, my dear Jackson, but she'll think, and her thoughts won't be pleasant. I mean for others. Do you expect to sink her to your own rank?" Dr. Lemon's bright little eyes rested more sharply on his hostess. "I don't understand you, and I don't think you understand yourself." This was not absolutely candid, for he did understand Mrs. Freer to a certain extent. It has been related that before he asked Lady Barb's hand of her parents, there had been moments when he himself doubted if a flower only to be described as of the social hothouse, that is, of aristocratic air, would flourish in American earth. But an intimation from another person that it was beyond his power to pass off his wife, whether she were the daughter of a peer or of a shoemaker, set all his blood on fire. It quenched on the instant his own perception of difficulties of detail, and made him feel only that he was dishonoured, he, the heir of all the ages, by such insinuations. It was his belief, though he had never before had occasion to put it forward, that his position, one of the best in the world, had about it the felicity that makes everything possible. He had had the best education the age could offer, for if he had rather wasted his time at Harvard, where he entered very young, he had, as he believed, been tremendously serious at Heidelberg and at Vienna. He had devoted himself to one of the noblest of professions, a profession recognized as such everywhere but in England, and had inherited a fortune far beyond the expectation of his earlier years, the years when he cultivated habits of work which alone, or rather in combination with talents that he neither exaggerated nor undervalued, would have conduced to distinction. He was one of the most fortunate inhabitants of an immense, fresh, rich country, a country whose future was admitted to be incalculable, and he moved with perfect ease in a society in which he was not overshadowed by others. It seemed to him, therefore, beneath his dignity to wonder whether he could afford, socially speaking, to marry according to his taste. He pretended to general strength, and what was the use of strength if you weren't prepared to undertake things timid people might find difficult? It was his plan to marry the woman he desired and not be afraid of her afterward. The effect of Mrs. Freer's doubt of his success was to represent to him that his own character wouldn't cover his wife's. She couldn't have made him feel worse if she had told him that he was marrying beneath him and would have to ask for indulgence. "I don't believe you know how much I think that any woman who marries me will be doing very well," he promptly added. "I'm very sure of that. But it isn't so simple, one's being an American," Mrs. Freer rejoined with a small philosophic sigh. "It's whatever one chooses to make it." "Well, you'll make it what no one has done yet if you take that young lady to America and make her happy there." "Do you think our country, then, such a very dreadful place?" His hostess had a pause. "It's not a question of what I think, but of what she will." Jackson rose from his chair and took up his hat and stick. He had actually turned a little pale with the force of his emotion. There was a pang of wrath for him in this fact that his marriage to Lady Barbarina might be looked at as too high a flight. He stood a moment leaning against the mantelpiece, and very much tempted to say to Mrs. Freer that she was a vulgar-minded old woman. But he said something that was really more to the point. "You forget that she'll have her consolations." "Don't go away, or I shall think I've offended you. You can't console an injured noblewoman." "How will she be injured? People will be charming to her." "They'll be charming to her, charming to her." These words fell from the lips of Dexter Freer, who had opened the door of the room and stood with the knob in his hand, putting himself into relation to his wife's talk with their visitor. This harmony was achieved in an instant. "Of course I know whom you mean," he said, while he exchanged greetings with Jackson. "My wife and I, naturally we're great busybodies, have talked of your affair, and we differ about it completely. She sees only the dangers, while I see all the advantages." "By the advantages he means the fun for us," Mrs. Freer explained, settling her sofa cushions. Jackson looked with a certain sharp blankness from one of these disinterested judges to the other. Even yet they scarce saw how their misdirected freedom wrought on him. It was hardly more agreeable to him to know that the husband wished to see Lady Barb in America than to know that the wife waved away such a vision. There was that in Dexter Freer's face which seemed to forecast the affair as taking place somehow for the benefit of the spectators. "I think you both see too much, a great deal too much, in the whole thing," he rather coldly returned. "My dear young man, at my age I may take certain liberties," said Dexter Freer. "Do what you've planned. I beseech you to do it. It has never been done before." And then, as if Jackson's glance had challenged this last assertion, he went on. "Never, I assure you, this particular thing. Young female members of the British aristocracy have married coachmen and fishmongers and all that sort of thing, but they've never married you and me." "They certainly haven't married the likes of either of you," said Mrs. Freer. "I'm much obliged to you for your advice." It may be thought that Jackson Lemon took himself rather seriously, and indeed I'm afraid that if he hadn't done so there would have been no occasion even for this summary report of him. But it made him almost sick to hear his engagement spoken of as a curious and ambiguous phenomenon. He might have his own ideas about it; one always had about one's engagement; but the ideas that appeared to have peopled the imagination of his friends ended by kindling a small hot expanse in each of his cheeks. "I'd rather not talk any more about my little plans," he added to his host. "I've been saying all sorts of absurd things to Mrs. Freer." "They've been most interesting and most infuriating," that lady declared. "You've been very stupidly treated." "May she tell me when you go?" her husband asked of the young man. "I'm going now. She may tell you whatever she likes." "I'm afraid we've displeased you," she went on. "I've said too much what I think. You must pardon me. It's all for your mother." "It's she whom I want Lady Barb to see!" Jackson exclaimed with the inconsequence of filial affection. "Dearie me!" Mrs. Freer gently wailed. "We shall go back to America and see how you get on," her husband said, "and if you succeed it will be a great precedent." "Oh, I shall succeed," and with this he took his departure. He walked away with the quick step of a man labouring under a certain excitement, walked up to Piccadilly and down past Hyde Park Corner. It relieved him to measure these distances, for he was thinking hard, under the influence of irritation, and it was as if his movement phrased his passion. Certain lights, flashed on him in the last half hour, turned to fire in him; the more that they had a representative value and were an echo of the common voice. If his prospects wore that face to Mrs. Freer, they would probably wear it to others; so he felt a sharp need to show such others that they took a mean measure of his position. He walked and walked till he found himself on the highway of Hammersmith. I have represented him as a young man with a stiff back, and I may appear to undermine this plea when I note that he wrote that evening to his solicitor that Mr. Hardman was to be informed he would agree to any proposals for settlements that this worthy should make. Jackson's stiff back was shown in his deciding to marry Lady Barbarina on any terms. It had come over him through the action of this desire to prove he wasn't afraid, so odious was the imputation, that terms of any kind were very superficial things. What was fundamental and of the essence of the matter would be to secure the grand girl and then carry everything out. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. "On Sundays now you might be at home," he said to his wife in the following month of March, more than 6 months after his marriage. "Are the people any nicer on Sundays than they are on other days?" Lady Barb asked from the depths of her chair, and without looking up from a stiff little book. He waited ever so briefly before answering. "I don't know whether they are, but I think you might be." "I'm as nice as I know how to be. You must take me as I am. You knew when you married me that I wasn't American." Jackson stood before the fire toward which his wife's face was turned and her feet extended. Stood there some time with his hands behind him and his eyes dropped a little obliquely on Lady Barb's bent head and richly draped figure. It may be said without delay that he was sore of soul, and it may be added that he had a double cause. He knew himself on the verge of the first crisis that had occurred between himself and his wife. The reader will note that it had occurred rather promptly, and he was annoyed at his annoyance. A glimpse of his state of mind before his marriage has been given the reader, who will remember that at that period our young man had believed himself lifted above possibilities of irritation. When one was strong one wasn't fidgety, and a union with a species of calm goddess would of course be a source of repose. Lady Barb was was an even calmer goddess still, and he had a much more intimate view of her divinity than on the day he had led her to the altar, but I'm not sure he felt either as firm or as easy. "How do you know what people are?" he said in a moment. "You've seen so few. You're perpetually denying yourself. If you should leave New York to-morrow you'd know wonderfully little about it." "It's all just the same," she pleaded. "The people are all exactly alike. There's only one sort." "How can you tell? You never see them." "Didn't I go out every night for the first 2 months we were here?" "It was only to about a dozen houses. Those, I agree, always the same. People, moreover, you had already met in London. You've got no general impressions." She raised her beautiful blank face. "That's just what I have got. I had them before I came. I see no difference whatever. They've just the same names, just the same manners." Again for an instant Jackson hung fire. Then he said with that practised flat candour of which mention has already been made and which he sometimes used in London during his courtship, "Don't you like it over here?" Lady Barb had returned to her book, but she looked up again. "Did you expect me to like it?" "I hoped you would, of course. I think I told you so." "I don't remember. You said very little about it. You seemed to make a kind of mystery. I knew, of course, you expected me to live here, but I didn't know you expected me to like it." "You thought I asked of you the sacrifice, as it were." "I'm sure I don't know," said Lady Barb. She got up from her chair and tossed her unconsolatory volume into the empty seat. "I recommend you to read that book," she added. "Is it interesting?" "It's an American novel." "I never read novels." "You had really better look at that one. It will show you the kind of people you want me to know." "I've no doubt it's very vulgar," Jackson said. "I don't see why you read it." "What else can one do? I can't always be riding in the park. I hate the park," she quite rang out. "It's just as good as your own," said her husband. She glanced at him with a certain quickness, her eyebrows slightly lifted. "Do you mean the park at Pasterns?" "No, I mean the park in London." "Oh, I don't care about London. One was only in London a few weeks." She had a horrible lovely ease. Yet he but wanted to help her to turn around. "I suppose you miss the country," he suggested. It was his idea of life that he shouldn't be afraid of anything, not be afraid, in any situation, of knowing the worst that was to be known about it. And the demon of a courage with which discretion was not properly commingled prompted him to take soundings that were perhaps not absolutely necessary for safety, and yet that revealed unmistakable rocks. It was useless to know about rocks if he couldn't avoid them. The only thing was to trust to the wind. "I don't know what I miss. I think I miss everything." This was his wife's answer to his too curious inquiry. It wasn't peevish, for that wasn't the tone of a calm goddess, but it expressed a good deal more than Lady Barb, who was rarely eloquent, had expressed before. Nevertheless, though his question had been precipitate, Jackson said to himself that he might take his time to think over what her fewness of words enclosed. He couldn't help seeing that the future would give him plenty of chance. He was in no hurry to ask himself whether poor Mrs. Freer, in Jermyn Street, mightn't after all have been right in saying that when it came to marrying an English caste product, it wasn't so simple to be an American doctor. It might avail little even in such a case to be the heir of all the ages. The transition was complicated, but in his bright mind it was rapid, from the brush of a momentary contact with such ideas to certain considerations which led him to go on after an instant. "Should you like to go down into Connecticut?" "Into Connecticut?" "That's one of our states. It's about as large as Ireland. I'll take you there if you like." "What does one do there?" "We can try and get some hunting." "You and I alone?" "Perhaps we can get a party to join us." "The people in the state?" "Yes, we might propose it to them." "The tradespeople in the towns?" "Very true. They'll have to mind their shops," Jackson said. "But we might hunt alone." "Are there any foxes?" "No, but there are a few old cows." Lady Barb had already noted that her husband sought the relief of a laugh at her expense, and she was aware that this present opportunity was neither worse nor better than some others. She didn't mind that trick in him particularly now, though in England it would have disgusted her. She had the consciousness of virtue, an immense comfort, and flattered herself she had learned the lesson of an altered standard of fitness. Besides which there were so many more disagreeable things in America than being laughed at by one's husband. But she pretended not to like it, because this made him stop, and above all checked discussion, which with Jackson was habitually so facetious and consequently so tiresome. "I only want to be left alone," she said in answer, though indeed it hadn't the style of an answer, to his speech about the cows. With this she wandered away to one of the windows that looked out on the Fifth Avenue. She was very fond of these windows, and had taken a great fancy to the Fifth Avenue, which, in the high-pitched winter weather, when everything sparkled, was bright and funny and foreign. It will be seen that she was not wholly unjust to her adoptive country. She found it delightful to look out of the window. This was a pleasure she had enjoyed in London only in the most furtive manner. It wasn't the kind of thing that girls in England did. Besides, in London, in Hill Street, there was nothing particular to see, whereas in the Fifth Avenue everything and every one went by, and observation was made consistent with dignity by the quantities of brocade and lace dressing, the embrasure, which somehow wouldn't have been tidy in England, and which made an ambush without concealing the brilliant day. Hundreds of women, the queer women of New York, who were unlike any that Lady Barb had hitherto seen, passed the house every hour, and her ladyship was infinitely entertained and mystified by the sight of their clothes. She spent more time than she was aware of in this recreation, and had she been addicted to returning upon herself, to asking herself for an account of her conduct, an inquiry she didn't indeed completely neglect, but made no great form of, she must have had a wan smile for this proof of what she appeared mainly to have come to America for, conscious though she was that her tastes were very simple, and that so long as she didn't hunt, it didn't much matter what she did. Her husband turned about to the fire, giving a push with his foot to a log that had fallen out of its place. Then he said, and the connection with the words she had just uttered was direct enough, "You really must manage to be at home on Sundays, you know. I used to like that so much in London. All the best women here do it. You had better begin to-day. I'm going to see my mother. If I meet any one, I'll tell them to come." "Tell them not to talk so much," said Lady Barb among her lace curtains. "Ah, my dear," Jackson returned, "it isn't every one who has your concision." And he went and stood behind her in the window, putting his arm round her waist. It was as much of a satisfaction to him as it had been 6 months before, at the time the solicitors were settling the matter, that this flower of an ancient stem should be worn upon his own breast. He still thought its fragrance a thing quite apart, and it was as clear as day to him that his wife was the handsomest woman in New York. He had begun, after their arrival, by telling her this very often, but the assurance brought no colour to her cheek, no light to her eyes. To be the handsomest woman in New York, now that she was acquainted with that city, plainly failed to strike her as a position in life. The reader may moreover be informed that, oddly enough, Lady Barb didn't particularly believe this assertion. There were some very pretty women in New York, and without in the least wishing to be like them, she had seen no woman in America whom she desired to resemble, she envied them some of their peculiar little freshnesses. It's probably that her own finest points were those of which she was the most unconscious. But Jackson was intensely aware of all of them. Nothing could exceed the minuteness of his appreciation of his wife. It was a sign of this that after he had stood behind her a moment he kissed her very tenderly. "Have you any message from my mother?" he asked. "Please give her my love. And you might take her that book." "What book?" "That nasty one I've been reading." "Oh, bother your books!" he cried, with a certain irritation, as he went out of the room. There had been a good many things in her life in New York that cost her an effort, but sending her love to her mother-in-law was not one of these. She liked Mrs. Lemon better than any one she had seen in America. She was the only person who seemed to Lady Barb really simple, as she herself understood that quality. Many people had struck her as homely and rustic, and many others as pretentious and vulgar, but in Jackson's mother she had found the golden mean of a discretion, of a native felicity, and modesty and decency, which, as she would have said, were really nice. Her sister Lady Agatha was even fonder of Mrs. Lemon, but then Lady Agatha had taken the most extraordinary fancy to every one and everything, and talked as if America were the most delightful country in the world. She was having a lovely time. She already spoke the most beautiful American, and had been, during the bright winter just drawing to a close, the most prominent girl in New York. She had gone out at first with her elder, but for some weeks past Lady Barb had let so many occasions pass that Agatha threw herself into the arms of Mrs. Lemon, who found her unsurpassably quaint and amusing, and was delighted to take her into society. Mrs. Lemon, as an old woman, had given up such vanities, but she only wanted a motive, and in her good nature she ordered a dozen new caps and sat smiling against the wall while her little English maid, on polished floors to the sound of music, cultivated the American step as well as the American tone. There was no trouble in New York about going out, and the winter wasn't half over before the little English maid found herself an accomplished diner, finding her way without any chaperone at all to feasts where she could count on a bouquet at her plate. She had had a great deal of correspondence with her own female parent on this point, and Lady Canterville had at last withdrawn her protest, which in the meantime had been perfectly useless. It was ultimately Lady Canterville's feeling that if she had married the handsomest of her daughters to an American doctor, she might let another become a professional raconteuse. Agatha had written to her that she was expected to talk so much, strange as such a destiny seemed for a girl of 19. Mrs. Lemon had even a higher simplicity than Lady Barb imputed to her, for she hadn't noticed that Lady Agatha danced much oftener with Herman Longstraw than with any one else. Jackson himself, though he went little to balls, had discovered this truth, and he looked slightly preoccupied when, after he had sat 5 minutes with his mother on the Sunday afternoon through which I have invited the reader to trace so much more than, I am afraid, is easily apparent of the progress of this simple story, he learned that his sister-in-law was entertaining Mr. Longstraw in the library. That young man had called half an hour before, and she had taken him into the other room to show him the seal of the Cantervilles, which she had fastened to one of her numerous trinkets. She was adorned with 100 bangles and chains, and the proper exhibition of which required a taper and a stick of wax. Apparently he was examining it very carefully, for they had been absent a good while. Mrs. Lemon's simplicity was further shown by the fact that she had not measured their absence. It was only when Jackson questioned her that she remembered. Herman Longstraw was a young Californian who had turned up in New York the winter before, and who travelled on his moustache, as they were understood to say in his native state. This moustache and some of its accompanying features were greatly admired. Several ladies in New York had been known to declare that they were as beautiful as a dream. Taken in connection with his tall stature, his familiar good nature, and his remarkable Western vocabulary, they constituted his only social capital. For of the two great divisions, the rich Californians and the poor Californians, it was well known to which he belonged. Dr. Lemon had viewed him as but a slightly mitigated cowboy, and was somewhat vexed at his own parent, though also aware that she could scarcely figure to herself what an effect such a form of speech as this remarkably straight echo of the prairie would produce in the halls of Canterville. He had no desire whatever to play a trick on the house to which he was allied, and knew perfectly that Lady Agatha hadn't been sent to America to become entangled with a Californian of the wrong denomination. He had been perfectly willing to bring her. He thought, a little vindictively, that this would operate as a hint to her progenitors on what he might have imagined doing if they hadn't been so stupidly bent on Mr. Hardman. Herman Longstraw, according to the legend, had been a trapper, a squatter, a miner, a pioneer, had been everything that one could be in the desperate parts of America, and had accumulated masses of experience before the age of 30. He had shot bears in the Rockies and buffaloes on the plains, and it was even believed that he had brought down animals of a still more dangerous kind among the haunts of men. There had been a story that he owned a cattle ranch in Arizona, but a later and apparently more authentic version of it, though representing him as looking after the cattle, didn't depict him as their proprietor. Many of the stories told about him were false, but there was no doubt his moustache, his native ease, and his native accent were the best of their kind. He danced very badly, but Lady Agatha had frankly told several persons that that was nothing new to her, and in short she delighted, this however she didn't tell, in Mr. Herman Longstraw. What she enjoyed in America was the revelation of freedom, and there was no such proof of freedom as absolutely unrestricted discourse with a gentleman who dressed in crude skins when not in New York, and who, in his usual pursuits, carried his life, as well as that of other persons, in his hand. A gentleman whom she had sat next to at a dinner in the early part of her visit had remarked to her that the United States were the paradise of women and of mechanics. And this had seemed to her at the time very abstract, for she wasn't conscious as yet of belonging to either class. In England she had been only a girl, and the principal idea connected with that was simply for one's misfortune one wasn't a boy. But she presently herself found the odd American world a true sojourn of the youthful blessed, and this helped her to know that she must be one of the people mentioned in the axiom of her neighbour, people who could do whatever they wanted, had a voice in everything, and made their taste and their ideas felt. She saw what fun it was to be a woman in America, and that this was the best way to enjoy the New York winter, the wonderful, brilliant New York winter, the queer, long-shaped, glittering city, the heterogeneous hours among which you couldn't tell the morning from the afternoon or the night from either of them, the perpetual liberties and walks, the rushings out and the droppings in, the intimacies, the endearments, the comicalities, the sleigh bells, the cutters, the sunsets on the snow, the ice parties in the frosty clearness, the bright, hot, velvety houses, the bouquets, the bonbons, the little cakes, the big cakes, the irrepressible inspirations of shopping, the innumerable luncheons and dinners offered to youth and innocence, the qualities of chatter of quantities of girls, the perpetual motion of the German, the suppers at restaurants after the play, the way in which life was pervaded by Delmonico, and Delmonico by the sense that though one's hunting was lost, and this therefore so different, it was very nearly as good. In all, through all, flowed a suffusion of loud, unmodulated, friendly sound, which reminded her of an endless tuning of rather bad fiddles. Lady Agatha was at present staying for a little change with Mrs. Lemon, and such adventures as that were part of the pleasure of her American season. The house was too close, but physically the girl could bear anything, and it was all she had to complain of. For Mrs. Lemon, as we know, thought her a weird little specimen, and had none of those old-world scruples in regard to spoiling young people, to which Lady Agatha herself now knew she must in the past have been unduly sacrificed. In her own way, it was not at all her sister's way, she liked to be of importance, and this was assuredly the case when she saw that Mrs. Lemon had apparently nothing in the world to do, after spending a part of the morning with her servants, but invent little distractions, many of them of the edible sort, for her guest. She appeared to have several friends, but she had no society to speak of, and the people who entered her house came principally to see Lady Agatha. This, as we have noted, was strikingly the case with Herman Longstraw. The whole situation gave the young stranger a great feeling of success of a new and unexpected kind. Of course, in England she had been born successful, as it might be called, through her so emerging in one of the most beautiful rooms at Pasterns, but her present triumph was achieved more by her own effort, not that she had tried very hard, and by her merit. It wasn't so much what she said, since she could never equal for quantity the girls of New York, as the spirit of enjoyment that played in her fresh young face with its pointless curves and shone in her grey English eyes. She enjoyed everything, even the street-cars, of which she made liberal use, and more than everything she enjoyed Mr. Longstraw and his talk about buffaloes and bears. Mrs. Lemon promised to be very careful as soon as her son had begun to warn her, and this time she had a certain understanding of what she promised. She thought people ought to make the matches they liked. She had given proof of this in her late behaviour to Jackson, whose own union was, to her sense, marked with all the arbitrariness of pure love. Nevertheless, she could see that Herman Longstraw would probably be thought rough in England, and it wasn't simply that he was so inferior to Jackson, for after all certain things were not to be expected. Jackson was not oppressed with his mother-in-law, having taken his precautions against such a danger, but he was certain he should give Lady Canterville a permanent advantage over him if her third daughter should, while in America, attach herself to a mere moustache. It was not always, as I have hinted, that Mrs. Lemon entered completely into the views of her son, though in form she never failed to subscribe to them devoutly. She had never yet, for instance, apprehended his reason for marrying poor Lady Barb. This was a great secret, and she was determined, in her gentleness, that no one should ever know it. For herself she was sure that to the end of time she shouldn't discover Jackson's reason. She might never ask about it, for that of course would betray her. From the first she had told him she was delighted, there being no need of asking for explanations then, as the young lady herself, when she should come to know her, would explain. But the young lady hadn't yet explained, and after this evidently never would. She was very tall, very handsome. She answered exactly to Mrs. Lemon's prefigurement of the daughter of a lord, and she wore her clothes, which were peculiar, but to one of her shape remarkably becoming, very well. But she didn't elucidate. We know ourselves that there was very little that was explanatory about Lady Barb. So Mrs. Lemon continued to wonder, to ask herself, why that one, more than so many others who'd have been more natural? The choice struck her, as I have said, as quite arbitrary. She found Lady Barb very different from other girls she had known, and this led her almost immediately to feel sorrow for her daughter-in-law. She felt how the girl was to be pitied if she found her husband's people as peculiar as his mother found her, since the result of that would be to make her very lonesome. Lady Agatha was different, because she seemed to keep nothing back. You saw all there was of her, and she was evidently not homesick. Mrs. Lemon could see that Barbarina was ravaged by this last ailment, and was too haughty to show it. She even had a glimpse of the ultimate truth, namely, that Jackson's wife had not the comfort of crying, because that would have amounted to a confession that she had been idiotic enough to believe in advance that in an American town, in the society of doctors, she should escape such pangs. Mrs. Lemon treated her with studied consideration, all the indulgence that was due to a young woman in the unfortunate position of having been married one couldn't tell why. The world, to the elder lady's view, contained two great departments, that of people and that of things, and she believed you must take an interest either in one or the other. The true incomprehensible in Lady Barb was that she cared for neither side of the show. Her house apparently inspired her with no curiosity and no enthusiasm, though it had been thought magnificent enough to be described in successive columns of the native newspapers. And she never spoke of her furniture or her domestics, though she had a prodigious show of such possessions. She was the same with regard to her acquaintance, which was immense, inasmuch as every one in the place had called on her. Mrs. Lemon was the least critical woman in the world, but it had occasionally ruffled her just a little that her daughter-in-law should receive every one in New York quite in the same automatic manner. There were differences, Mrs. Lemon knew, and some of them of the highest importance, but poor Lady Barb appeared never to suspect them. She accepted every one and everything and asked no questions. She had no curiosity about her fellow citizens, and as she never assumed it for a moment, she gave Mrs. Lemon no opportunity to enlighten her. Lady Barb was a person with whom you could do nothing unless she left you an opening, and nothing would have been more difficult than to post her, as her mother-in-law would have said, against her will. Of course she picked up a little knowledge, but she confounded and transposed American attributes in the most extraordinary way. She had a way of calling every one doctor, and Mrs. Lemon could scarcely convince her that this distinction was too precious to be so freely bestowed. She had once said to that supporter that in New York there was nothing to know people by, their names were so very monotonous. And Mrs. Lemon had entered into this enough to see that there was something that stood out a good deal in Barbarina's own prefix. It is probable that during her short period of domestication complete justice was not done Lady Barb. She never, as an instance, got credit for repressing her annoyance at the poverty of the nominal signs and styles, a deep desolation. That little speech to her husband's mother was the most reckless sign she gave of it, and there were few things that contributed more to the good conscience she habitually enjoyed than her self-control on this particular point. Dr. Lemon was engaged in professional researches just now, which took up a great deal of his time, and for the rest he passed his hours unreservedly with his wife. For the last 3 months, therefore, he had seen his other nearest relative scarcely more than once a week. In spite of researches, in spite of medical societies, where Jackson, to her knowledge, read papers, Lady Barb had more of her husband's company than she had counted on at the time she married. She had never known a married pair to be so much together as she and Jackson. He appeared to expect her to sit with him in the library in the morning. He had none of the occupations of gentlemen and noblemen in England, for the element of politics appeared to be as absent as the element of the chase. There were politics in Washington, she had been told, and even at Albany, and Jackson had proposed to introduce her to these cities. But the proposal, made to her once at dinner, before several people, had excited such cries of horror that it fell dead on the spot. "We don't want you to do anything of that kind," one of the ladies had said, and Jackson had appeared to be discouraged. That is, if in regard to Jackson she could really tell. "Pray, what is it you want me to see?" Lady Barb had asked on this occasion. "Well, New York and Boston. Boston if you want to very much, but not otherwise. And then Niagara. But more than anything, Newport." She was tired of their eternal Newport. She had heard of it 1,000 times, and felt already as if she had lived there half her life. She was sure, moreover, that she should hate the awful little place. This is perhaps as near as she came to having a lively conviction on any American subject. She asked herself whether she was then to spend her life in the Fifth Avenue with alternations of a city of villas. She detested villas, and wondered if that was all the great American country had to offer her. There were times when she believed she should like the backwoods, and that the far West might be a resource, for she had analyzed her feelings just deep enough to discover that when she had, hesitating a good deal, turned over the question of marrying Jackson Lemon, it was not in the least of American barbarism she was afraid. Her dread had been all of American civilization. She judged the little lady I have just quoted a goose, but that didn't make New York any more interesting. It would be reckless to say that she suffered from an overdose of Jackson's company, since she quite felt him her most important social resource. She could talk to him about England, about her own England, and he understood more or less what she wished to say, when she wished to say anything, which was not frequent. There were plenty of other people who talked about England, but with them the range of allusion was always the hotels, of which she knew nothing, and the shops and the opera and the photographs. They had the hugest appetite for photographs. There were other people who were always wanting her to tell them about Pasterns, and the manner of life there, and the parties. But if there was one thing Lady Barb disliked more than another, it was describing Pasterns. She had always lived with people who knew of themselves what such a place would be, without demanding these pictorial efforts, proper only, as she vaguely felt, to persons belonging to the classes whose trade was in the arts of expression. Lady Barb, of course, had never gone into it, but she knew that in her own class the business was not to express but to enjoy, not to represent but to be represented, though indeed this latter liability might involve offence, for it may be noted that even for an aristocrat Jackson Lemon's wife was aristocratic. Lady Agatha and her visitor came back from the library in course of time, and Jackson Lemon felt it his duty to be rather cold to Herman Longstraw. It wasn't clear to him what sort of a husband his sister-in-law would do well to look for in America, if there were to be any question of husbands. But as to that he wasn't bound to be definite, provided he should rule out Mr. Longstraw. This gentleman, however, was not given to noticing shades of manner. He had little observation, but very great confidence. "I think you had better come home with me," Jackson said to Lady Agatha. "I guess you've stayed here long enough." "Don't let him say that, Mrs. Lemon," the girl cried. "I like being with you so awfully." "I try to make it pleasant," said Mrs. Lemon. "I should really miss you now, but perhaps it's your mother's wish." If it was a question of defending her guest from ineligible suitors, Mrs. Lemon felt of course that her son was more competent than she, though she had a lurking kindness for Herman Longstraw, and a vague idea that he was a gallant, genial specimen of unsophisticated young America. "Oh, mamma wouldn't see any difference," Lady Agatha returned, with pleading blue eyes on her brother-in-law. "Mamma wants me to see every one. You know she does. That's what she sent me to America for. She knows, for we've certainly told her enough, that it isn't like England. She wouldn't like it if I didn't sometimes stay with people. She always wanted us to stay at other houses. And she knows all about you, Mrs. Lemon, and she likes you immensely. She sent you a message the other day, and I'm afraid I forgot to give it you, to thank you for being so kind to me and taking such a lot of trouble. Really she did, but I forgot it. If she wants me to see as much as possible of America, it's much better I should be here than always with Barb. It's much less like one's own country. I mean it's much nicer for a girl," said Lady Agatha affectionately to Mrs. Lemon, who began also to look at Jackson under the influence of this uttered sweetness, which was like some quaint little old air, she thought, played upon a faded spinet with two girlish fingers. "If you want the genuine thing, you ought to come out on the plains," Mr. Longstraw interposed, with bright sincerity. "I guess that was your mother's idea. Why don't you all come out?" He had been looking intently at Lady Agatha, while the remarks I have just repeated succeeded each other on her lips, looking at her with a fascinated approbation, for all the world as if he had been a slightly slow-witted English gentleman, and the girl herself a flower of the West, a flower that knew the celebrated language of flowers. Susceptible even as Mrs. Lemon was, he made no secret of the fact that Lady Agatha's voice was music to him, his ear being much more accessible than his own inflections would have indicated. To Lady Agatha those inflections were not displeasing, partly because, like Mr. Herman himself in general, she had not a perception of shades, and partly because it never occurred to her to compare them with any other tones. He seemed to her to speak a foreign language altogether, a romantic dialect through which the most comical meanings gleamed here and there. "I should like it above all things," she said in answer to his last observation. "The scenery's ahead of anything round here," Mr. Longstraw went on. Mrs. Lemon, as we have gathered, was the mildest of women, but, as an old New Yorker, she had no patience with some of the new fashions. Chief among these was the perpetual reference, which had become common only within a few years, to the outlying parts of the country, the states and territories of which children in her time used to learn the names in their order at school, but which no one ever thought of going to or talking about. Such places, in her opinion, belonged to the geography books, or at most to the literature of newspapers, but neither to society nor to conversation. And the change, which, so far as it lay in people's talk, she thought at bottom a mere affectation, threatened to make her native land appear vulgar and vague. For this amiable daughter of Manhattan, the normal existence of man, and still more of women, had been located, as she would have said, between Trinity Church and the beautiful reservoir at the top of Fifth Avenue, monuments of which she was personally proud, and if we could look into the deeper parts of her mind, I am afraid we should discover there an impression that both the countries of Europe and the remainder of her own continent were equally far from the centre and the light. "Well, scenery isn't everything," she made soft answer to Mr. Longstraw, "and if Lady Agatha should wish to see anything of that kind, all she has got to do is to take the boat up the Hudson." Mrs. Lemon's recognition of this river, I should say, was all it need have been. She held the Hudson existed for the purpose of supplying New Yorkers with poetical feelings, helping them to face comfortably occasions like the present, and in general meet foreigners with confidence, part of the oddity of foreigners being their conceit about their own places. "That's a good idea, Lady Agatha. Let's take the boat," said Mr. Longstraw. "I've had great times on the boats." Lady Agatha fixed on her amoroso her singular charming eyes, eyes of which it was impossible to say at any moment whether they were the shyest or the frankest in the world, and she was not aware while this contemplation lasted that her brother-in-law was observing her. He was thinking of certain things while he did so, of things he had heard about the English, who still, in spite of his marrying into a family of that nation, appeared to him very much through the medium of hearsay. They were more passionate than the Americans, and they did things that would never have been expected. Though they seemed steadier and less excitable, there was much social evidence to prove them more wildly impulsive. "It's so very kind of you to propose that," Lady Agatha said in a moment to Mrs. Lemon. "I think I've never been on a ship, except of course coming from England. I'm sure mamma would wish me to see the Hudson. We used to go in immensely for boating in England." "Did you boat in a ship?" Herman Longstraw asked, showing his teeth hilariously and pulling his moustaches. "Lots of my mother's people have been in the Navy." Lady Agatha perceived vaguely and good-naturedly that she had said something the odd Americans thought odd, and that she must justify herself. Something most unnatural was happening to her standard of oddity. "I really think you had better come back to us," Jackson repeated. "Your sister's very lonely without you." "She's much more lonely with me. We're perpetually having differences. Barb's dreadfully vexed because I like America instead of— And Lady Agatha paused a moment, for it just occurred to her that this might be treacherous. "Instead of what?" Jackson inquired. "Instead of perpetually wanting to go to England as she does," she went on, only giving her phrase a little softer turn, for she felt the next moment that Barb could have nothing to hide and must of course have the courage of her opinions. "Of course England's best, but I dare say I like to be bad," the girl said artlessly. "Oh, there's no doubt you're awfully bad," Mr. Longstraw broke out with joyous eagerness. Naturally he couldn't know that what she had principally in mind was an exchange of opinions that had taken place between her sister and herself just before she came to stay with Mrs. Lemon. This incident, of which he himself was the occasion, might indeed have been called a discussion, for it had carried them quite into the cold air of the abstract. Lady Barb had said she didn't see how Agatha could look at such a creature as that, an odious, familiar, vulgar being, who had not about him the rudiments of a gentleman. Lady Agatha had replied that Mr. Longstraw was familiar and rough, and that he had a twang, and thought it amusing to talk to her as the Princess, but that he was a gentleman for all that, and was tremendous fun whatever one called him. It didn't seem to matter what one called any one or anything there. Her sister had returned to this, that if he was rough and familiar he couldn't be a gentleman, inasmuch as that was just what a gentleman meant, a man who was civil and well-bred and well-born. Lady Agatha had argued that such a point was just where she differed, that a man might perfectly be a gentleman and yet be rough and even ignorant, so long as he was really nice. The only thing was that he should be really nice, which was the case with Mr. Longstraw, who, moreover, was quite extraordinarily civil as a man could be. And then Lady Agatha herself made the strongest point she had ever made in her life, she had never been so inspired, in saying that Mr. Longstraw was rough perhaps, but not rude, a distinction altogether wasted on her sister, who declared that she hadn't come to America, of all places, to learn what a gentleman was. The discussion, in short, had been a trifle grim. I know not whether it was the tonic effect on them two, alien organisms as they were, of the fine winter weather, or that of Lady Barb's being bored and have nothing else to do, but Lord Canterville's daughters went into the question with the moral earnestness of a pair of approved Bostonians. It was part of Lady Agatha's view of her admirer that he after all much resembled other tall people with smiling eyes and tawny moustaches, who had ridden a good deal in rough countries and whom she had seen in other places. If he was more familiar, he was also more alert. Still, the difference was not in himself, but in the way she saw him, the way she saw everybody in America. If she should see the others in the same way, no doubt they'd be quite the same. And Lady Agatha sighed a little over the possibilities of life, for this peculiar way, especially regarded in connection with gentlemen, had become very pleasant to her. She had betrayed her sister more than she thought, even though Jackson didn't particularly show it in the tone in which he commented, "Of course she knows she's going to see your mother in the summer." His tone was rather that of irritation at so much harping on the very obvious. "Oh, it isn't only mamma," the girl said. "I know she likes a cool house," Mrs. Lemon contributed. "When she goes you had better bid her good-bye," Lady Agatha went on. "Of course I shall bid her good-bye," said Mrs. Lemon, to whom apparently this remark was addressed. "I'll never bid you good-bye, Princess," Herman Longstraw interposed. "You can bet your life on that." "Oh, it doesn't matter about me, for of course I shall come back. But if Barb once gets to England, she never will." "Oh, my dear child!" Mrs. Lemon wailed, addressing her young visitor, but looking at her son, who on his side looked at the ceiling, at the floor, looked above all very conscious. "I hope you don't mind my saying that, Jackson dear," Lady Agatha said to him, for she was very fond of her brother-in-law. "Ah, well then she shan't go there," he threw off in a moment, with a small strange dry laugh that attached his mother's eyes in shy penetration to his face. "But you promised mamma, you know," said the girl with the confidence of her affection. Jackson's countenance expressed to her none even of his very moderate hilarity. "Your mother, then, must bring her back." "Get some of your navy people to supply an ironclad," cried Mr. Longstraw. "It would be very pleasant if the Marchioness could come over," said Mrs. Lemon. "Oh, she'd hate it more than poor Barb," Lady Agatha quickly replied. It didn't at all suit her to find a Marchioness inserted into her field of vision. "Doesn't she feel interested from what you've told her?" Lady Agatha's admirer inquired. But Jackson didn't heed his sister-in-law's answer. He was thinking of something else. He said nothing more, however, about the subject of his thought, and before 10 minutes were over took his departure, having meanwhile neglected also to revert to the question of Lady Agatha's bringing her visit to his mother to a close. It wasn't to speak to him of this, for as we know she wished to keep the girl and somehow couldn't bring herself to be afraid of Herman Longstraw, that when her son took leave she went with him to the door of the house, detaining him a little while she stood on the steps, as people had always done in New York in her time, though it was another of the new fashions she didn't like, the stiffness of not coming out of the parlour. She placed her hand on his arm to keep him on the stoop, and looked up and down into the lucid afternoon and the beautiful city, its chocolate-coloured houses so extraordinarily smooth, in which it seemed to her that even the most fastidious people ought to be glad to live. It was useless to attempt to conceal it. His marriage had made a difference and a worry, had put a barrier that she was yet under the painful obligation of trying to seem not to notice. It had brought with it a problem much more difficult than his old problem of how to make his mother feel herself still, as she had been in his childhood, the dispenser of his rewards. The old problem had been easily solved. The new was a great tax. Mrs. Lemon was sure her daughter-in-law didn't take her seriously, and that was a part of the barrier. Even if Barbarina liked her better than any one else, this was mostly because she liked every one else so little. Mrs. Lemon had in her nature no grain of resentment, and it wasn't to feed a sense of wrong that she permitted herself to criticize her son's wife. She couldn't help feeling that his marriage wasn't altogether fortunate if his wife didn't take his mother seriously. She knew she wasn't otherwise remarkable than as being his mother, but that position, which was no merit of hers, the merit was all Jackson's in being her son, affected her as one which, familiar as Lady Barb appeared to have been in England with positions of various kinds, would naturally strike the girl as very high and to be accepted as freely as a fine morning. If she didn't think of his mother as an indivisible part of him, perhaps she didn't think of other things either, and Mrs. Lemon vaguely felt that, remarkable as Jackson was, he was made up of parts, and that it would never do that these should be rated lower one by one, since there was no knowing what that might end in. She feared that things were rather cold for him at home when he had to explain so much to his wife, explain to her, for instance, all the sources of happiness that were to be found in New York. This struck her as a new kind of problem altogether for a husband. She had never thought of matrimony without a community of feeling in regard to religion and country. One took those great conditions for granted, just as one assumed that one's food was to be cooked, and if Jackson should have to discuss them with his wife, he might, in spite of his great abilities, be carried into regions where he would get entangled and embroiled, from which, even possibly, he wouldn't come back at all. Mrs. Lemon had a horror of losing him in some way, and this fear was in her eyes as she stood by the doorway of her house, and after she had glanced up and down the street, eyed him a moment in silence. He simply kissed her again and said she would take cold. "I'm not afraid of that. I've a shawl." Mrs. Lemon, who was very small and very fair, with pointed features and an elaborate cap, passed her life in a shawl, and owed to this habit her reputation for being an invalid, an idea she scorned naturally enough, inasmuch as it was precisely her shawl that, as she believed, kept every ill at bay. "Is it true Barbarina won't come back?" she then asked. "I don't know that we shall ever find out. I don't know that I shall take her to England," Jackson distinctly returned. She looked more anxious still. "Didn't you promise, dear?" "I don't know that I promised. Not absolutely." "But you wouldn't keep her here against her will," quavered Mrs. Lemon. "I guess she'll get used to it," he returned, with a levity that misrepresented the state of his nerves. Mrs. Lemon looked up and down the street again and gave a little sigh. "What a pity she isn't American." She didn't mean this as a reproach, a hint of what might have been. It was simply embarrassment resolved into speech. "She couldn't have been American," said Jackson with decision. "Couldn't she, dear?" His mother spoke with conscientious respect. She felt there were imperceptible reasons in this. "It was just as she is that I wanted her," Jackson added. "Even if she won't come back?" Mrs. Lemon went on with wonder. "Oh, she has got to come back," Jackson said as he went down the steps. Chapter 6. Lady Barb, after this, didn't decline to see her New York acquaintances on Sunday afternoons, though she refused for the present to enter into a project of her husband's, who thought it would be pleasant she should entertain his friends on the evening of that day. Like all good Americans, Dr. Lemon devoted much consideration to the great question of how, in his native land, society was to be brought into being. It seemed to him it would help on the good cause, for which so many Americans are ready to lay down their lives, if his wife should, as he jocularly called it, open a saloon. He believed, or tried to believe, the salon now possible in New York, on condition of its being reserved entirely for adults. And in having taken a wife out of a country in which social traditions were rich and ancient, he had done something toward qualifying his own house, so splendidly qualified in all strictly material respects, to be the scene of such an effort. A charming woman, accustomed only to the best on each side, as Lady Beauchemin said, what mightn't she achieve by being at home, always to adults only, in an easy, early, inspiring, comprehensive way, and on the evening of the 7 when worldly engagements were least numerous? He laid this philosophy before Lady Barb in pursuance of a theory that if she disliked New York on short acquaintance she couldn't fail to like it on a long. Jackson believed in the New York mind, not so much indeed in its literary, artistic, philosophic or political achievements as in its general quickness and nascent adaptability. He clung to this belief, for it was an indispensable neat block in the structure he was attempting to rear. The New York mind would throw its glamour over Lady Barb if she would only give it a chance, for it was thoroughly bright, responsive, and sympathetic. If she would only set up by the turn of her hand a blessed snug social centre, a temple of interesting talk in which this charming organ might expand, and where she might inhale its fragrance in the most convenient and luxurious way, without, as it were, getting up from her chair. If she would only just try this graceful, good-natured experiment, which would make every one like her so much too, he was sure all the wrinkles in the gilded scroll of his fate would be smoothed out. But Lady Barb didn't rise at all to his conception, and hadn't the least curiosity about the New York mind. She thought it would be extremely disagreeable to have a lot of people tumbling in on Sunday evening without being invited, and altogether her husband's sketch of the Anglo-American saloon seemed to her to suggest crude familiarity, high vociferation (she had already made a remark to him about screeching women), and random extravagant laughter. She didn't tell him, for this somehow it wasn't in her power to express, and strangely enough he never completely guessed it, that she was singularly deficient in any natural or indeed acquired understanding of what a saloon might be. She had never seen or dreamed of one, and for the most part was incapable of imagining a thing she hadn't seen. She had seen great dinners and balls and meets and runs and races. She had seen garden parties and bunches of people, mainly women, who, however, didn't screech, at dull stuffy teas, and distinguished companies collected in splendid castles. But all this gave her no clue to a train of conversation, to any idea of a social agreement that the interest of talk, its continuity, its accumulations from season to season, shouldn't be lost. Conversation, in Lady Barb's experience, had never been continuous. In such a case it would surely have been a bore. It had been occasional and fragmentary, a trifle jerky, with allusions that were never explained. It had a dread of detail. It seldom pursued anything very far, or kept hold of it very long. There was something else she didn't say to her husband in reference to his visions of hospitality, which was that if she should open a saloon, she had taken up the joke as well, for Lady Barb was eminently good-natured, Mrs. Vanderdecken would straightway open another, and Mrs. Vanderdeckens would be the more successful of the two. This lady, for reasons Lady Barb had not yet explored, passed for the great personage of New York. There were legends of her husband's family having behind them a fabulous antiquity. When this was alluded to, it was spoken of as something incalculable and lost in the dimness of time. Mrs. Vanderdecken was young, pretty, clever, incredibly pretentious, Lady Barb thought, and had a wonderfully artistic house. Ambition was expressed further in every rustle of her garments, and if she was the first lady in America, bar none, this had an immense sound, it was plain she intended to retain the character. It was not till after she had been several months in New York that Lady Barb began to perceive this easy mistress of the field crying out gracious goodness before she was hurt to have flung down the glove, and when the idea presented itself, lighted up by an incident I have no space to report, she simply blushed a little, for Mrs. Vanderdecken, and held her tongue. She hadn't come to America to bandy words about precedence with such a woman as that. She had ceased to think of that convenience. Of course one was obliged to think in England, though an instinct of self-preservation, old and deep-seated, led her not to expose herself to occasions on which her imputed claim might be tested. This had at bottom much to do with her having, very soon after the first flush of the honours paid her on her arrival, and which seemed to her rather grossly overdone, taken the line of scarcely going out. They can't keep that up, she had said to herself, and in short she would stay, less boringly both for herself and for others, at home. She had a sense that whenever and wherever she might go forth, she should meet Mrs. Vanderdecken, who would withhold or deny or contest or even magnanimously concede something. Poor Lady Barb could never imagine what. She didn't try to, and gave little thought to all this, for she wasn't prone to confess to herself fears, especially fears from which terror was absent. What in the world had Mrs. Vanderdecken that she, Barbara Lemon, what a name, could want? But, as I have said, it abode within her as a presentiment that if she should set up a drawing-room in the foreign style, based, that is, on the suppression of prattling chits and hobbledehoys, this sharp skirmisher would be beforehand with her. The continuity of conversation, oh, that she would certainly go in for. There was no one so continuous as Mrs. Vanderdecken. Lady Barb, as I have related, didn't give her husband the surprise of confiding to him these thoughts, though she had given him some other surprises. He would have been decidedly astonished, and perhaps after a bit a little encouraged, at finding her liable to any marked form of exasperation. On the Sunday afternoon she was visible, and at one of these junctures, going into her drawing-room, he found her entertaining two ladies and a gentleman. The gentleman was Sidney Feeder, and one of the ladies none other than Mrs. Vanderdecken, whose ostensible relations with her were indeed of the most cordial nature. Intending utterly to crush her, as two or three persons, not perhaps conspicuous for a narrow accuracy, gave out that she privately declared, Mrs. Vanderdecken yet wished at least to study the weak points of the invader, to penetrate herself with the character of the English girl. Lady Barb verily appeared to have for the representative of the American patriciate a mysterious fascination. Mrs. Vanderdecken couldn't take her eyes off her victim, and whatever might be her estimate of her importance, at least couldn't let her alone. "Why does she come to see me?" poor Lady Barb asked herself. "I'm sure I don't want to see her. She has done enough for civility long ago." Mrs. Vanderdecken had her own reasons, one of which was simply the pleasure of looking at the doctor's wife, as she habitually called the daughter of the Cantervilles. She wasn't guilty of the rashness of depreciating the appearance of so markedly fine a young woman, but professed a positive, unbounded admiration for it, defending it on many occasions against those of the superficial and stupid who pronounced her left nowhere by the best of the home-grown specimens. Whatever might have been Lady Barb's weak points, they included neither the curve of her cheek and chin, the setting of her head on her throat, nor the quietness of her deep eyes, which were as beautiful as if they had been blank, like those of antique busts. "The head's enchanting, perfectly enchanting," Mrs. Vanderdecken used to say irrelevantly, and as if there were only one head in the place. She always used to ask about the doctor, which was precisely another reason why she came. She dragged in the doctor at every turn, asking if he were often called up at night, found it the greatest of luxuries, in a word, to address Lady Barb as the wife of a medical man and as more or less au courant of her husband's patients. The other lady on this Sunday afternoon was a certain little Mrs. Chew, who had the appearance of a small but very expensive doll, and was always asking Lady Barb about England, which Mrs. Vanderdecken never did. The latter discoursed on a purely American basis, and with that continuity of which mention has already been made, while Mrs. Chew engaged Sidney Feeder on topics equally local. Lady Barb liked Sidney Feeder; she only hated his name, which was constantly in her ears during the half-hour the ladies sat with her, Mrs. Chew having, like so many persons in New York, the habit, which greatly annoyed her, of re-apostrophizing and re-designating every one present. Lady Barb's relations with Mrs. Vanderdecken consisted mainly in wondering, while she talked, what she wanted of her, and in looking, with her sculptured eyes, at her visitor's clothes, in which there was always much to examine. "Oh, Dr. Feeder! Now, Dr. Feeder! Well, Dr. Feeder!" These exclamations on Mrs. Chew's lips were an undertone in Lady Barb's consciousness. When we say she liked her husband's confrère, as he never failed to describe himself, we understand that she smiled on his appearance and gave him her hand and asked him if he would have tea. There was nothing nasty, as they so analytically said in London, about Lady Barb, and she would have been incapable of inflicting a deliberate snub on a man who had the air of standing up so squarely to any purpose he might have in hand. But she had nothing of her own at all to say to Sidney Feeder. He apparently had the art of making her shy, more shy than usual, since she was always a little so. She discouraged him completely, and reduced him to naught. He wasn't a man who wanted drawing out; there was nothing of that in him; he was remarkably copious; but she seemed unable to follow him in any direction, and half the time evidently didn't know what he was saying. He tried to adapt his conversation to her needs, but when he spoke of the world, of what was going on in society, she was more at sea even than when he spoke of hospitals and laboratories and the health of the city and the progress of science. She appeared, indeed, after her first smile when he came in, which was always charming, scarcely to see him, looking past him and above him and below him, everywhere but at him, till he rose to go again, when she gave him another smile, as expressive of pleasure and of casual acquaintance as that with which she had greeted his entry. It seemed to imply that they had been having a delightful communion. He wondered what the deuce Jackson Lemon could find interesting in such a woman, and he believed his perverse, though gifted colleague, not destined to feel her, in the long run, enrich or illuminate his life. He pitied Jackson. He saw that Lady Barb, in New York, would neither assimilate nor be assimilated, and yet he was afraid, for very compassion, to betray to the poor man how the queer step he had taken, now so dreadfully irrevocable, might be going to strike most others. Sidney Feeder was a man of a strenuous conscience, who did loyal duty overmuch and from the very fear he mightn't do it enough. In order not to appear to, he called upon Lady Barb heroically, in spite of pressing engagements, and week after week, enjoying his virtue himself as little as he made it fruitful for his hostess, who wondered at last what she had done to deserve this extremity of appreciation. She spoke of it to her husband, who wondered also what poor Sidney had in his head, and yet naturally shrank from damping too brutally his zeal. Between the latter's wish not to let Jackson see his marriage had made a difference, and Jackson's hesitation to reveal to him that his standard of friendship was too high, Lady Barb passed a good many of those numerous hours during which she asked herself if they were the sort of thing she had come to America for. Very little had ever passed between her and her husband on the subject of the most regular of her bores, a clear instinct warning her that if they were ever to have scenes she must choose the occasion well, and this odd person not being an occasion. Jackson had tacitly admitted that his confrère was anything she chose to think him. He was not a man to be guilty in a discussion of the disloyalty of damning a real friend with praise that was faint. If Lady Agatha had been less of an absentee from her sister's fireside meanwhile, Dr. Feeder would have been better entertained, for the younger of the English pair prided herself, after several months in New York, on understanding everything that was said, on interpreting every sound, no matter from what lips the monstrous mystery fell. But Lady Agatha was never at home. She had learned to describe herself perfectly by the time she wrote her mother that she was always on the go. None of the innumerable victims of old-world tyranny welcome to the land of freedom had yet offered more a lavish incense to that goddess than this emancipated London debutante. She had enrolled herself in an amiable band known by the humorous name of the Terrors, a dozen young ladies of agreeable appearance, high spirits, and good wind, whose most general characteristic was that, when wanted, they were to be sought anywhere in the world but under the roof supposed to shelter them. They browsed far from the fold, and when Sidney Feeder, as sometimes happened, met Lady Agatha at other houses, she was in the hands of the irrepressible Longstraw. She had come back to her sister, but Mr. Longstraw had followed her to the door. As to passing it, he had received direct discouragement from her brother-in-law, but he could at least hang about and wait for her. It may be confided to the reader, at the risk of discounting the effect of the only passage in this very level narrative form to startle, that he never had to wait very long. When Jackson Lemon came in, his wife's visitors were on the point of leaving her, and he didn't even ask his colleague to remain, for he had something particular to say to Lady Barb. "I haven't put to you half the questions I wanted. I've been talking so much to Dr. Feeder," the dressy Mrs. Chew said, holding the hand of her hostess in one of her own and toying at one of Lady Barb's ribbons with the other. "I don't think I've anything to tell you. I think I've told people everything," Lady Barb answered rather wearily. "You haven't told me much," Mrs. Vanderdecken richly radiated. "What could one tell you? You know everything," Jackson impatiently laughed. "Ah, no, there are some things that are great mysteries for me," this visitor promptly pronounced. "I hope you're coming to me on the 17th," she added to Lady Barb. "On the 17th? I believe we go somewhere." "Do go to Mrs. Vanderdecken," said Mrs. Chew. "You'll see the cream of the cream." "Oh, gracious!" Mrs. Vanderdecken vaguely cried. "Well, I don't care. She will, won't she, Dr. Feeder? The very pick of American society." Mrs. Chew stuck to her point. "Oh, I've no doubt Lady Barb will have a good time," said Sidney Feeder. "I'm afraid you missed the bran," he went on with irrelevant jocosity to Jackson's bride. He always tried the jocose when other elements had failed. "The bran?" Jackson's bride couldn't think. "Where you used to ride, in the park." "My dear fellow, you speak as if we had met at the circus," her husband interposed. "I haven't married a mountebank." "Well, they put some stuff on the road," Sidney Feeder explained, not holding much to his joke. "You must miss a great many things," said Mrs. Chew tenderly. "I don't see what," Mrs. Vanderdecken tinkled, "except the fogs and the Queen. New York's getting more and more like London. It's a pity. You ought to have known us 30 years ago." "You're the Queen here," said Jackson Lemon, "but I don't know what you know about 30 years ago." "Do you think she doesn't go back? She goes back to the last century," cried Mrs. Chew. "I dare say I should have liked that," said Lady Barb, "but I can't imagine." And she looked at her husband, a look she often had, as if she vaguely wished him to do something. He was not called upon, however, to take any violent steps, for Mrs. Chew presently said, "Well, Lady Barb, good-bye." Mrs. Vanderdecken glared genially, and as for excessive meaning at her hostess, and addressed a farewell, accompanied very audibly with his title, to her host. And Sidney Feeder made a joke about stepping on the trains of the ladies' dresses as he accompanied them to the door. Mrs. Chew had always a great deal to say at the last. She talked till she was in the street, and then she addressed that prospect. But at the end of 5 minutes Jackson Lemon was alone with his wife, to whom he then announced a piece of news. He prefaced it, however, by an inquiry as he came back from the hall. "Where's Agatha, my dear?" "I haven't the least idea. In the street somewhere, I suppose." "I think you ought to know a little more." "How can I know about things here? I've given her up. I can do nothing with her. I don't care what she does." "She ought to go back to England," Jackson said after a pause. "She ought never to have come." "It was not my proposal, God knows," he sharply returned. "Mamma could never know what it really is," his wife more quietly noted. "No, it hasn't been as yet what your mother supposed. The man Longstraw wants to marry her and has made a formal proposal. I met him half an hour ago in Madison Avenue, and he asked me to come with him into the Columbia Club. There, in the billiard room, which to-day is empty, he opened himself, thinking evidently that in laying the matter before me he was behaving with extraordinary propriety. He tells me he's dying of love, and that she's perfectly willing to go and live in Arizona." "So she is," said Lady Barb. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him I was convinced it would never do, and that at any rate I could have nothing to say to it. I told him explicitly, in short, what I had told him virtually before. I said we should send Aggie straight back to England, and that if they had the courage they must themselves broach the question over there." "When will you send her back?" asked Lady Barb. "Immediately. By the very first steamer." "Alone, like an American girl?" "Don't be rough, Barb," Jackson replied. "I shall easily find some people. Lots of them are sailing now." "I must take her myself," Lady Barb observed in a moment. "I brought her out, so I must restore her to my mother's hands." He had expected this, and believed he was prepared for it. But when it came, he found his preparation not complete. He had no answer to make, none at least that seemed to him to go to the point. During these last weeks it had come over him with a quiet, irresistible, unmerciful force that Mrs. Dexter Freer had been right in saying to him that Sunday afternoon in Jermyn Street, the summer before, that he would find it wasn't so simple to be an American. Such a character was complicated in just the measure that she had foretold by the difficulty of domesticating any wife at all liberally chosen. The difficulty wasn't dissipated by his having taken a high tone about it. It pinched him from morning till night. It hurt him like a misfitting shoe. His high tone had given him courage when he took the great step. But he began to perceive that the highest tone in the world couldn't change the nature of things. His ears tingled as he inwardly noted that if the Dexter Freers, whom he had thought alike abject in their hopes and their fears, had been by ill luck spending the winter in New York, they would have found his predicament as good fun as they could wish. Drop by drop the conviction had entered his mind. The first drop had come in the form of a word from Lady Agatha, that if his wife should return to England she would never again later recross the Atlantic. That word from the competent source had been the touch from the outside at which often a man's fear crystallizes. What she would do, how she would resist, this he wasn't yet prepared to tell himself, but he felt every time he looked at her that the beautiful woman he had adored was filled with a dumb, insuperable, ineradicable purpose. He knew that if she should plant herself firm, no power on earth would move her, and her blooming antique beauty, and the general loftiness of her breeding, came fast to seem to him but the magnificent expression of a dense, patient, ponderous power to resist. She wasn't light, she wasn't supple, and after 6 months of marriage he had made up his mind that she wasn't intelligent, in spite of all which she would elude him. She had married him, she had come into his fortune and his consideration, for who was she after all? He was on occasion so angry as to ask himself, remembering that in England Lady Claras and Lady Florences were as thick as blackberries, but she would have nothing to do, if she could help it, with his country. She had gone in to dinner first in every house in the place, but this hadn't satisfied her. It had been simple to be an American in the good and easy sense that no one else in New York had made any difficulties. The difficulties had sprung from the consummate make of her, which were after all what he had married her for, thinking they would be a fine temperamental heritage for his brood. So they would, doubtless, in the coming years and after the brood should have appeared, but meanwhile they interfered with the best heritage of all, the nationality of his possible children. She would do, indeed, nothing violent, he was tolerably certain of that. She wouldn't return to England without his consent, only when she should return it would be once for all. His one possible line, then, was not to take her back, a position replete with difficulties, since he had in a manner given his word, she herself giving none at all beyond the formal promise murmured at the altar. She had been general, but he had been specific. The settlements he had made were a part of that. His difficulties were such as he couldn't directly face. He must tack in approaching so uncertain a coast. He said to his wife presently that it would be very inconvenient for him to leave New York at that moment. She must remember their plans had been laid for a later move. He couldn't think of letting her make the voyage without him, and on the other hand they must pack her sister off without delay. He would therefore make instant inquiry for a chaperone, and he relieved his irritation by cursing the name and every other attribute of Herman Longstraw. Lady Barb didn't trouble herself to denounce this gentleman. Her manner was that of having for a long time expected the worst. She simply remarked, after having listened to her husband for some minutes in silence, "I'd quite as lief she should marry Dr. Feeder." The day after this he closeted himself for an hour with his sister-in-law, taking great pains to set forth to her the reasons why she shouldn't marry her Californian. Jackson was kind, he was affectionate, he kissed her and put his arm around her waist. He reminded her that he and she were the best of friends, and that she had always been awfully nice to him. Therefore he counted on her. She'd break her mother's heart. She'd deserve her father's curse, and she'd get him, Jackson, into a pickle from which no human power might ever disembroil him. Lady Agatha listened and cried. She returned his kiss very affectionately, and admitted that her father and mother would never consent to such a marriage. And when he told her that he had made arrangements that she should sail for Liverpool with some charming people the next day but one, she embraced him again and assured him she could never thank him enough for all the trouble he had taken about her. He flattered himself he had convinced and in some degree comforted her, and he reflected with complacency that even should his wife take it into her head, Barb would never get ready to embark for her native land between a Monday and a Wednesday. The next morning Lady Agatha failed to appear at breakfast, though, as she usually rose very late, her absence excited no immediate alarm. She hadn't rung her bell and was supposed still to be sleeping, but she had never yet slept later than midday, and as this hour approached her sister went to her room. Lady Barb then discovered that she had left the house at 7 o'clock in the morning and had gone to meet Mr. Longstraw at a neighbouring corner. A little note on the table explained it very succinctly, and put beyond the power of the Jackson Lemons to doubt that by the time this news reached them their wayward sister had been united to the man of her preference as closely as the laws of the state of New York could bind her. Her little note set forth that as she knew she should never be permitted to marry him, she had resolved to marry him without permission, and that directly after the ceremony, which would be of the simplest kind, they were to take a train for the far West. Our record is concerned only with the remote consequences of this affair, which made, of course, a great deal of trouble for poor Jackson. He pursued the fugitives to remote rocky fastnesses, and finally overtook them in California, but he hadn't the boldness to propose to them to separate, for he promptly made out that Herman Longstraw was at least as well married as himself. Lady Agatha was already popular in the new States, where the history of her elopement, emblazoned in enormous capitals, was circulated in 1,000 newspapers. The question of the newspapers had been for our troubled friend one of the most definite results of his sister-in-law's coup de tête. His first thought had been of the public prints, and his first exclamation a prayer that they shouldn't get hold of the story. They had, however, got hold of it with a myriad wildly waved hands, and were scattering it broadcast over the world. Lady Barb never caught them in the act. She succeeded perfectly in not seeing what she needn't, but an affectionate friend of the family, travelling at that time in the United States, made a parcel of some of the leading journals and sent them to Lord Canterville. This missive elicited from her ladyship a letter, addressed to her son-in-law, which shook the young man's position to the base. The files of a rank vulgarity had been opened on the house of Canterville, and the noble matron demanded that in compensation for the affronts and injuries heaped upon her family, and bereaved and dishonoured as she was, she should at least be allowed to look on the face of her second daughter. "I suppose you'll not, for very pity, be deaf to such a prayer as that," said Lady Barb, and though loath to record a second act of weakness on the part of a man with pretensions to be strong, I may not disguise the fact that poor Jackson, who blushed dreadfully over the newspapers and felt afresh as he read them the force of Mrs. Freer's terrible axiom, poor Jackson paid a visit to the office of the Cunarders. He said to himself later on that it was the newspapers that had done it. He couldn't decently appear to be on their side. They made it so hard to deny that the country was impossible at a time when one was in need of all one's arguments. Lady Barb, before sailing, definitely refused to mention any week or month as the date of their prearranged return to New York. Very many weeks and months have elapsed since then, and she gives no sign of coming back. She will never fix a date. She is much missed by Mrs. Vanderdecken, who still alludes to her, still says the line of the shoulders was superb, putting the statement pensively in the past tense. Lady Betjeman and Lady Marmaduke are much disconcerted. The international project has not, in their view, received an impetus. Jackson Lemon has a house in London, and he rides in the park with his wife, who is as beautiful as the day, and who a year ago presented him with a little girl exhibiting features that he already scans for the look of race, whether in hope or in fear today is more than my muse has revealed. He has occasional scenes with Lady Barb, during which the look of race is very clear in her own countenance, but they never terminate in a visit to the Cunarders. He's exceedingly restless and is constantly crossing to the Continent, but he returns with a certain abruptness, for he hates meeting the Dexter Freers, who seem to pervade the more comfortable parts of Europe. He dodges them in every town. Sidney Feeder feels very badly about him. It's months since Jackson has sent him any results. The excellent fellow goes very often in a consolatory spirit to see Mrs. Lemon, but has not yet been able to answer her standing question, why that girl more than another? Lady Agatha Longstraw and her husband arrived a year ago in England, and Mr. Longstraw's personality had immense success during the last London season. It's not exactly known what they live on, though perfectly known that he's looking for something to do. Meanwhile, it's as good as known that their really quite responsible brother-in-law supports them. End of Chapter 6. End of Lady Barbarina by Henry James.